Well, yeah, I mean, thank you for that. To even talking about the silent majority, and its connections to today, it's good thing that kids aren't going to learn about that in school, right?
That is, is like a part of the goal is, trying to people that want to, um, fight against supposed CRT, that
Mm,
the goal is to, hide and mystify
mm,
that history so we can't learn from
mm-hmm.
it. And, part of, the reason why I wanted to write this book is because, you know, history is cyclical. That
Oh
like
yeah.
we're not moving in a straight line, we're kind of moving in a spiral, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where yes, we are progressing forward, but we, come back
Mm,
to these spaces
yeah.
time and time again. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from how this nation failed during the crack epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
And especially as we go through another drug epidemic with opioids,
Right.
we should be looking back at how Black Americans really saved ourselves
Yeah.
during a really, really tough era.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that too. Like, I don't know if it was the mid '90s or so, but when the federal law was made, is what how the mandatory sentences for crack cocaine were exponentially more than for cocaine, for the powder. Not always, but often, racially, separated in those ways. That was something that the President Obama changed a bit, took it down. But I mean, some of it's just, on his face is incredibly racist and unequal. I wonder, and then watching the way that the opioid epidemic has been treated, and I think in many ways there are a lot of good things about the way it's been treated. Right, it's a lot more about, okay, let's get treatment, let's treat it as an addiction, let's treat them as people. I
Yeah.
wonder if if it has been more in stark relief or stark contrast as you've seen the way the opioid epidemic has been covered, often with white people. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah,
like where
absolutely.
was that sympathy in the '80s and the '90s? In the crack
Yeah.
epidemic,
That this country is so inconsistent when it comes to drugs
right?
that, for me growing up in a nation or really in a neighborhood that was hard hit by the crack epidemic, I was fed so much anti-drug um, uh, propaganda.
Mm.
I'm still terrified of drugs.
Mm.
But, when I got to college and grad school and I was living in New York and you see people using drugs recreationally, you realize, oh, we didn't all get the same message.
Right.
That there is a double standard
Mm-hmm.
on drugs in this country, and that goes back as far as the '70s with the glamorization of cocaine
Mm-hmm.
for some folks, and it was the glamorization of cocaine and its normalization
Mm-hmm.
of cocaine that led to the crack epidemic, right?
Right.
People in neighborhoods like mine were only attracted to crack in the beginning because it was cheap, accessible cocaine, and
Mm.
they wanted to be fancy like the
Mm-hmm.
people in Hollywood that were doing powder cocaine.
Mm.
Um, and then when it comes to a substance like when it comes to opioids and a substance like fentanyl, it's good to see the empathy that the
Right.
government and the average American seems to have. But I have to say that I don't think that we're any smarter as
Mm.
it relates to the policy. That
Mm.
I read a story recently that there were supposed to be these uh, uh, good Samaritan laws that if you are a person who is, using, let's say, fentanyl with like a friend and your friend overdoses,
Mm-hmm.
and then you call 911, that you will not be charged with possession
Okay.
of drugs. And this is a law that is, or these laws exist in many jurisdictions as a way of just trying to save people's lives that
Mm.
otherwise folks won't call 911. Well, what's happening is prosecutors are not charging those good Samaritans with possession. They're charging them with things like
Oh,
um, endangerment for
okay.
other people that may be present, or for the paramedics that are there, making the argument that they've been exposed to fentanyl, so they've been endangered, paramedics. And what that says to me is We just haven't learned the lesson that we would rather create more harm by criminalizing people than to try to take an approach that would save people's lives.
Wow. Yeah. So you're talking about like kind of like the Hollywoodization of cocaine, and so late 70s, early 80s, there's some really important events. Richard Pryor had the tragic event where he, freebase, and he basically like almost burned himself to death, right?
Yeah, that's such an interesting story because that had always been what people said, that Richard Pryor was freebasing. Freebase
Yeah.
is the first name for crack. It was a way of making smokable cocaine, but it used more volatile chemicals. Important to note then, right, that the invention of crack has its roots in a scientific community, that it wasn't, street kids that were creating freebase. It was people with a knowledge of how to separate the base of a compound from its other elements, how to free the base. Richard Pryor's widow has since said that he actually did not blow himself up freebasing, but he had attempted suicide. He had poured a high proof rum on himself and set himself on fire. And that just goes towards, right, like how many myths we were fed about crack in particular, right? That Richard Pryor blew himself up, that Lynn Bias, the basketball star who had just been drafted to the Boston Celtics, that his heart stopped because he smoked crack. Lynn Bias's heart did stop, but he was using powder cocaine. Lynn Bias's death in particular is what spurred the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. So, again, these distinctions are important because the myth goes towards this idea of crack as a super drug, crack users as subhuman people, crack dealers as super predators.
Well, I wish it wasn't, but it's a great transition into, I guess, maybe 84, 85, the Jimmy's World story. You talk about like myths, and this was a story that ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize, kind of. I don't know if it has an asterisk next to it, or, how Wikipedia would list it, because it won, but was, basically taken back. And this was a woman who wrote about, what was he? Very young kid, Jimmy, and just the hellish life that he lived, and getting high, and just like a crack den, and all of the stereotypes, all the myths coming together in one. If anybody would have done anybody at the newspaper would have done any sort of backing up or looking for facts, they would have seen this is an absolutely outlandish story. I wonder not so much about the person who wrote it and about the newspaper, but about the public kind of accepting it, accepting this story, like, oh yeah, that could happen.
Yeah, that story is always so wild to me because a lot of people don't know about it. It's the only Pulitzer that's ever been given back. And Janet Cook was the first Black woman to win a Pulitzer for news writing. So it was a big deal when it happened. And it was a story about a 9-year-old heroin addict.
Right.
So this really it predates the crack epidemic, but it's an example of the reporting that was to come. The and aside from the fact that, give me 1 second, I need to change my AirPod. It said recording stuff. Okay, there we go. Janet Cook and the story of Jimmy's World really shows the extent to which people are willing to believe the worst about Black folks in particular. That, so much about that story screamed fabrication from the very beginning. And lots of people at the Washington Post in that newsroom set aside their journalistic standards to publish it, to like bring it to the fore and to put it on the front page of the paper, right? So Bob Woodward was executive editor at the time, someone who was lauded for his ability to, handle anonymous sources, never looked into who Jimmy actually was, that they, ran the story with illustrations because they couldn't use pictures. And then, when Black staffers at the Post said, this doesn't seem right. I don't think we should do
Mm.
it. They
Mm.
were accused of professional jealousy.
Ah.
Then, beyond all of the issues with the story, and it's still going to print, it also gets nominated for a Pulitzer. So, the newsroom decided, yes, this is a questionable story, but we still think that it's good enough to nominate.
Mm.
And then it wins the Pulitzer. So the entire journalism community, right, had a commitment to advancing and elevating this storytelling that was far from sound.
Yes.
And, it's a shame. I am a journalist in part because there are so many lies told about the community that I come from, and there's so much misinformation about the community that I come from, and always, joke with my partner. I say, you can say anything about Black people, because our lives are shrouded in mystery, because people sort of believe that we must be fundamentally different. And the truth is actually a lot more boring, which is that, like, we're not mystical characters, we're just brown people. And that our lives are moved by larger forces in society, and we make decisions independently and personally, just like, white people do and Asian people do. But that doesn't stop stories like Jimmy's World from being published even today.
Yeah, what an amazing story. I mean, thanks for bringing that to light. It was kind of random, but I got like a chuckle out of it, or it's like, whoa, that was weird. That Gabriel Garcia Marquez weighed in on it, and he was a former journalist. We're talking about the story, and he was a former journalist as well, right? But he basically said something to the effect of like, it's great fiction, but it's not necessarily the greatest reporting.
Yeah, that they should have given her the Pulitzer Prize for fiction.
Exactly. Yeah. The even going further back in history, I mean, I'd known some of this, but just the ways in which, I mean, almost, I mean, maybe literally Coca-Cola, because of that propaganda and hysteria over, suppose you talk about like mythical figures and this like, like minorities, Latinos, Black people became, super predators, super people on cocaine or marijuana and all of this. And it was just like, whoa. And it was just so even leading to like a massacre, right?
Yeah, exactly. There
A
was
racist massacre.
that the Atlanta race riot started because in part because of cocaine. This idea, okay, so to kind of take a step back, a lot of people have heard that Coca-Cola, which was founded in Atlanta, included at some point cocaine in its recipe. And that's partly true, that there was coca leaf extract, which still there is coca leaf extract in Coca-Cola.
There is,
but they have removed the
narcotic
properties.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
But it is a part of the original recipe for it. And it just has to do with the history of cocaine, that cocaine was put into lots of drinks and substances. And, you could get a cocktail with a little cocaine in it at a bar. And what grew out of that was this idea that Black people, Black men in particular, went crazy when consuming cocaine. So, publications like the New York Times ran headlines about Negro cocaine fiends raping white women. And so when there was a story of white women assaulted in Atlanta in, I believe, 1903, lots of white folks gathered in downtown Atlanta, and they started a riot that led to the massacre of black folks in that city. And they started in the main business district in Black Atlanta, which was Auburn Avenue, first destroying bars where drinks like Coca-Cola would be served, and then working their way into Black neighborhoods. And it's a story as old as time, right? That like this fear of what a substance can do in the wrong body, creating such a violent response.
Wow. So as we get into the individual characters and their stories, the with the mayor, the future mayor, forgetting his first name, sorry, Mr. Smoke. Kurt, excuse me. Kurt Smoke, and just one of those guys that we all know. He's just meant for big things. He's brilliant. He's he's fairly reserved, but he's an incredible scholar. We see down the road that he's not the type to necessarily make fiery speeches and fiery proclamations, but just brilliant. We know that it was coming. He, in his time as mayor, I believe, I'm not sure if he's still in like city council or something, but there was a drug buy, a setup where Marty Ward, I want to say one of the police officers, was killed, and Kurt knew him and was obviously was in shock and incredibly saddened. But after and pressed for the criminals to be prosecuted, of course, to the fullest extent of the law, but also after a little bit of reflection, that's kind of where decriminalization became a thing for him, right? Yeah. Like, this is something. Let's take a step back, and you can talk morals and ethics all you want about like the drug war, but simply, if we're talking practicalities, right, it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked the way it's been done, right? So there was some of that there, and he later on in later years, he was given speeches for even the Democratic National Convention, and his thing was like to talk about decriminalization, how we could do it, and he was almost just roundly just either ignored or like, what are you doing? This can't possibly happen. What had he seen? What was it that spoke to this idea that decriminalization is the way to go?
Kurt Schmoke, just a brilliant guy. He and really charmed and positioned for leadership from the time that he was a boy. He integrated Baltimore City College, which is a high school despite its name. Baltimore City College. He helped integrate that school. He was a senior class president. He was captain of the football team senior and junior year. Took them to and won 2 state championships in those years.
Dang, I know he's
nasty. And then he's recruited to Yale on a football scholarship, and then becomes a Rhodes Scholar, goes to Oxford, gets a law degree from Harvard, and he wants nothing more than to go back and improve Baltimore as mayor. So, his first stop was as a prosecutor. And as you said, he listened to a colleague, a Black detective named Marty Ward, shot during a drug buy. And he listened to that tape of Marty Ward dying. And he concluded that the guy that shot Marty Ward was as addicted to the drug money as addicts were to the drug. And he wanted to remove that incentive. That he thought that was his first sort of glimpse of, this could be different if we just legalized it, that we would take away the money, which would take away then the violence that protects the trade.
Right.
So he also too, had the luck of being married. He still is married to a physician. So he, I think, learned from his wife and was inspired by the fact that Baltimore has a medical institution like Johns Hopkins to say that we could have a public health response to drugs and not just criminal justice. Also want to underline the fact that while Baltimore struggled with crack, Baltimore historically has had a problem with heroin. That it is one of the major ports for heroin in this country. So the heroin there has always been cheaper and more accessible. So they still struggle with that. And, heroin in the 80s came along with higher rates of HIV and AIDS because of the intravenous drug use. Right. So I think that Kurt Schmoke, he was dealing with a city that had a unique problem, but also unique resources. Yes. And he wanted Baltimore to model a public health response. And, as you mentioned, he was laughed, out of many congressional hearings because people just thought that was ridiculous.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's really emblematic of just politics as usual, I guess. As we see with Trumpsters and all that, the ones who seem to yell the loudest get the most results, right? But the ones who are the most right, the ones who are have the confidence of knowledge, seem to be laughed at or ignored, right?
Yeah. Well, it's important to remember too and I really learned this covering the criminal justice system, that it's big business. It is, aside from the sort of like private institutions that make money off of incarcerating people, and that's everything from bail bondsmen to the people who do, the ankle monitors,
Sure.
to the
Food
folks
service,
that
right?
food service, but it's also a jobs program for a lot of people
Mm.
in this country, that a lot of public funds, make their way to police departments. A lot of military equipment makes its way to police
Yep.
departments. And a lot of politicians are elected with the support of police unions,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there is a system that is in place that people are reluctant to disrupt,
Right.
even if it doesn't show results.
Right. Well, yeah. So I mean, his eureka, if you will, about decriminalization, which I'm sure had been building for years. It wasn't just a one-time thing, but that comes after years of the of Reagan's war on drugs, and we all remember Just Say No, and but so interesting. And I knew about this, but really you put it into great detail about the Bidens and Clintons and Democrats. You see names like Chuck Schumer and names you still hear today, and just about how they were almost trying to out Republican the Republicans, right?
Yeah.
With really tough I mean, shoot, when the anecdote about Clinton going to like personally watch the death penalty being I can't think of the word, being fulfilled, being
Yeah.
carried out, was just like, geez, because today Democrats want to set themselves apart from Republicans, and we're in all these different ways, but it was like I said, they were trying to out Republican the Republicans. I wonder what we should take from that. It was 25, 30 years ago where there really was not as much of a difference maybe between Republicans and Democrats, and the lessons to be learned from that, hard fist, broken windows policy right about, and just mixed results at the best and horrific results at worst.
I think that yes, there was a time where Democrats saw their way back into politics as being tough on crime.
Right.
There's a reason why both the president and vice president were both drug warriors, right? Why, Kamala Harris was a prosecutor.
Yeah.
Kurt Schmoke, as mayor of Baltimore, he was able to become electable as a Black Democrat by first being a prosecutor. That
Sure.
was a path that many Democrats sort of took into office.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because the Republicans had done so well at saying, we're the people who will keep you safe.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way to become electable in the 80s and 90s was to race the Republicans to the bottom. I think that the public should hold those folks accountable today. That somebody like Joe Biden, who has his hands over every crime bill going back to the first Reagan administration, has a responsibility to repair the harm. We talked about that 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for, between crack and powdered cocaine. That makes no sense because they're the same substance. That was reduced under the Obama administration in 2010 to 18-to-1.
It's still 18,
and
yeah.
It's still 18-to-1, right? That, like, with all we know about the substance, with all we know about the way that it spurred mass incarceration, there hasn't been enough political will to eliminate it entirely. And who better than Joe Biden as, really like the head Democrat pushing those policies? Someone whose son was a crack addict at the time that he was calling for the execution of people in possession of crack. I think that he has a responsibility to make that right, beyond just speeches saying, we didn't know, I was wrong, right? That there's still work to be done. And we have to, I think, as a public, hold elected officials, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, we have to hold everybody accountable to giving us good, useful policy. Otherwise, we're ruining lives, and we're wasting money, and we're missing opportunities to shore up these cracks in our social safety, right? Because we didn't get things right during crack, those are the gaps that people are still falling through now with fentanyl and with opioids. The reason why all that we have to offer opioid addicts is the police
Mm-hmm.
is because we didn't create a system during crack
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to create an alternative.
Yeah. Band-aids, right? Band-aids, if that, not
Mm-hmm.
taking care of the wounds for sure. The boy, what was I going to say? You're talking about, yeah. So you make a really interesting point too about, you talk about something that's been mythologized or propagandized or demonized, hip hop, and just like hip hop as part of it, not the only thing, but that really kind of signaled the end of this era. The Chronic. I mean, the Chronic is about weed, and if on a very similar level, like weed is much less, destructive, I guess, right,
Yeah.
than cocaine. And I always tell my students this, my high school students about this. I feel like I've been saying this for 10 years, just about smoking, like talking like nicotine, like how great, I mean, vaping has changed things a bit, but how great it is that these generations, these younger generations, they don't smoke anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, right? We
Yeah.
remember in our lifetime, like, I mean, now you see somebody smoking. I'm in, California. It's just like, whoa, somebody's smoking.
Yeah.
My kids are 7 and 5 and are just like shocked. But this idea that like, as it was written about, even like in the mid 90s, it was just like, yeah, this generation, they called the blunt generation at that time. They have a disdain for hard drugs. That was pretty cool. As well as
Yeah.
just, you talk about like just community standing up. You talk about a hardy, Heart, hardy in that way, a hardy, black community, which, of course, has had so many obstacles, is putting it lightly, over the years. You talk about individual stories of groups, stepping in. I think the uh like the Nation of Islam and on the East Coast, and like not in our neighborhood type of thing, and really just individuals making a difference. You end with towards the end, you talk about Atlanta in the COVID era, so a couple years ago, and there were some violent incidents that may or may not have been connected to, kids on the corner for the most part selling waters.
Yeah.
And you're like, hey, that's a substance too, just like another thing. And it's kind of like what might be coming next. I wonder how, if you can explain that story a little bit about the outlawing. I don't know if that's been changed. I hope it has. The outlawing of kids selling water in a hot Atlanta summer, and kind of how that's indicative of the way that we are oppressive, especially to young people and
Yeah.
people of color.
When I finished this book, um, I was really disappointed, when I looked around at the world. 2020 was when my writing really finished in earnest. And I felt like I had learned these lessons from the crack era, and I had kind of seen the factors that facilitated it in terms of just such disaffection among communities of color in particular. And in 2020, we were dealing with, COVID, which completely again had hit Black folks hardest, first, worst. We were also dealing with protests about, economic conditions, policing, the things that we were protesting, going into the crack era. And, I looked around and I saw these young men, middle school, high school aged, who were selling bottled water in Atlanta, which is something that, if you've ever lived in the South, you just see, people make a few bucks here and there by, buying water wholesale and selling it resale.
Mm.
So, or retail. And, there were a few incidents where people felt threatened by these young men, and it turned into an effort to criminalize selling water.
Mm.
And I thought, wow, that we said decades ago that it was about crack, that it was about this powerful substance. But
Mm.
now you have a substance as simple as water,
The most neutral
making
substance
people,
on earth, right?
like really getting people, up in arms. And that signaled to me that we hadn't developed the empathy that we need for young people,
Mm-hmm.
especially young Black people and young Black men in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Having been a young Black man, it's so hard to get that first job.
You're still young.
It's
Yeah,
Ish.
ish.
But I remember what it was like to want things and to want
Hmm.
to be a part of the world and to feel shut out. And then to also to be criminalized as you're trying to make an effort. And I thought how different it would be if this time around, if instead of offering, policing as an option, if we said, hey, business owners, how can we create a program where you can pay these young people over
Mm.
the summer because they're obviously hardworking, they're obviously industrious, they're
Yeah.
obviously creative. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That like instead of framing them as a problem, how can we leverage what they're already doing and make it something good? And
Hmm.
we owe it to young people to do that. That they're only making the best of the world that we've given them.
Sure.
We've given them a pretty messed up world.
Hmm.
So, whatever we can do, things big and small, like let's do that.
It's a great place to end. In preparing for this interview, I really thought this conversation, I really thought that I would be talking a lot more about the individual stories, which are maybe the best. I mean, the book is so good because it melds the historical with the individual stories. I want people listening to buy the book. I want people listening to read those individual stories because they're so compelling. You talked about, giving young people a chance. So Sean McCray, who's now a basketball coach, I think all of us know that great mentor at a school who just is all about the kids, is all about helping. And there's that beautiful story about where he was, you know, a slight little aside here, but that's another thing about this book. Like you talk about, it's not like people are on the corner just saying, come here, kid, let me get you addicted to drugs, right? Something about the book that was just like how Sean and so many others kind of dipped in and out of selling, right? It wasn't like his 24/7 for 15 straight years. There were times when he was doing well financially in other ways. There were times when he said, I'm not going to do this. I can't do this. He was in school, all those different things. But it seems like maybe towards the end of his time, when he's doing some selling, he's like, this is it. I'm never going to do it again. He's driving through. He sees this kid, 11, 12-year-old kid who's, fussing with his mom, maybe like starting a fight of some sort. Gets his kid, talks to him, finds out he loves hoops. Sean's been coaching hoops, gets him in the program. The kid brings in other friends, and it just becomes a self-propelling thing. Beautiful story. And I guess my last question for you is, you talked about that pessimism in the macro, right? That pessimism about the world, and how could you not be? And you same things that were being talked about in 1982, often being talked about in 2023. Did the individual stories, and they don't all have beautiful, happy, neat endings, but do those individual stories give you some more optimism with Elgin and Lenny, who's now Miss and doing great work, with helping others to get out of addiction? Do those individual stories give you some lift, some hope?
They do. That in terms of what we do about society and our systems, I think that those are really complex, questions. But what's clear to me is that we survived the crack epidemic through the power of community care and individual action. And, we kept each other alive through those
Mm.
small gestures long enough for the storm to pass.
Mm.
So, you know, I am deeply invested in mentorship. I'm deeply invested in, if there's one thing that you care about, if there's one group that you care about or an issue, you know, do something, like small things even, and especially if there's a young person that you can prevent from going down maybe some of the wrong roads that you went down,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that you should do.
Mm-hmm.
And that is as important as the big policy.
Mm-hmm.
That if enough of us do that, then we can really save ourselves.
Yeah.
I think is the way to put it. Yeah.
I mean, it's not lip service to say that you really do humanize them. I mean, how do you not empathize with Lenny? She was, I mean, the traumas. She was a sexual abuse victim at least twice, rape. I mean, let's not put a nicer word on it. That one harrowing situation where she was almost a victim of maybe being killed. With that guy who driving her through the night and the meat hook and the whole deal. And Elgin, who had a father who was never the role model for him, and it literally was selling off his own clothes, Elgin's father, to make money for drugs. And how about that odd couple where a couple of his fellow drug sellers just kind of moved into the apartment?
Yeah.
Couple buddies, a couple buddies of mine. Of course, like talk about Sean's story. You do an incredible job with the history, with the macro. We didn't even get into the whole CIA in Nicaragua, Iran Contra, which is something that you do a great job with, and the Dark Alliance stories. Long story short, what a work. It's just been a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak to you about such a book that humanizes and also puts a larger historical stamp on something. You are well within your rights to just chill and relax and and never write a book again. But if you want to share any future projects you're working on, you want to share?
I'm very interested in podcasting, actually.
Okay.
I think that there's something to putting sound to these stories, and especially as a Black storyteller, including Black expressiveness as a way of making some of these stories feel more immediate. I read my own audiobook as practice.
Oh, cool.
So I'm excited to see what I can do through, in long form storytelling through podcasting.
Would it be the book? Would it be some of the book and some other things?
I'm very interested in maybe doing more around Jimmy's World.
Okay.
And the story of Janet Cook.
Yeah. Give me 10 seconds. I'm gonna pre-subscribe to it already, even though it doesn't exist. I'm gonna manifest it, into reality.
Perfect.
I would definitely subscribe to that. Well, thank you so much again. It's been a pleasure talking to you. People need to buy the book. It's One World Lit. Am I correct on that?
It is. That's right. It's When Crack Was King, available everywhere books are sold. Published by One World Random House.
Don't forget about the X, Donovan X Ramsey, can be found online for sure. Any cool bookstores that you want to shout out? I know we can buy it anywhere.
Yeah, I love Reparations Club in Los Angeles. I love For Keeps in Atlanta.
Okay.
And McNally Jackson all throughout New York.
Thanks again so much. Been a pleasure, and I wish you great luck in your continued writing.
Thank you so much, Peter. This was fantastic.
Appreciate you.